When you see someone weeping in sorrow, either because a child has gone on a journey or because he has lost his property, beware that you be not carried away by the impression that the man is in the midst of external ills, but straightway keep before you this thought: it is not what has happened that distresses this man, for it does not distress another, but his judgment about it. Do not, however, hesitate to sympathize with him so far as words go, and if occasion offers, even to groan with him. But be careful not to groan also in the center of your being. Chapter 16 is a particularly important section of the Enchiridion because what it reveals to us is the Stoic approach to other people's misfortune. And this actually goes to answering a question that gets asked quite a lot, which is, how should a Stoic approach other people having things happen to them that at least they see as bad? In part because, according to Stoic doctrine, what is in our control is what is good or bad. What's outside of our control is an external, is an indifferent. It might be preferred or rejected, but it's ultimately without the same sort of moral value as what does lie within our control. So you would think that the Stoic would spread that good news in dealing with people who, say, are grieving or anxious or angry or upset about different things. And that's not what Epictetus tells us to do. So it's really quite important that we look at what he does advise. He says, when you see somebody weeping in sorrow, either because a child has gone on a journey or because he has lost his property, something that a lot of people would see as a real calamity. And we could add a lot of other things to this. Some people get upset like that when somebody breaks off a relationship. If they're the one who's dumped, but also if they're the one who has to break it off. When a job ends, when the economy takes a downturn, when some people get as upset like that when their sports team loses, particularly if it's in the championships and they could have gone all the way this year. So we see people weeping, we see people upset, we see people anxious, we see people angry. How should we respond to them then? He says, beware that you be not carried away by the impression, by the fantasia, the appearance that the person is in the midst of external ills. But straightway keep before you the thought, and this is applying the thought that we see in another chapter, it is not the things themselves that disturb us, it's our judgments about the things. We then apply that to another person. And Epictetus says, it's not what has happened that distresses this person, for it does not distress another, like, for example, me right off the bat, or somebody else in similar circumstances. Some people are fine when their kids go off to camp. Some people are A-okay when they lose their property. Some people are quite all right when their job ends and they have to figure out what to do. So it's not what has happened that distresses this person, but this person's judgment about it. What we can do is, as Stoics, we can say, this not only applies to me, but it applies to everyone else who's a human being. It's our judgments about things that turn them into the big problems they are. Oftentimes, on the basis, we have an appearance, and then we make all sorts of assumptions and inferences about it and connect it with past experiences that we have and projections into the future. Our fears and our desires, our aversions get bound up with it. And before long, we're very upset. And we're convinced that we're upset because that external thing made us upset in that way. Oftentimes, it turns out that we're not even on base about what that external thing is. We're mistaken about it. But even if it is the way it presents itself, you find out you're gonna die of cancer, right? There's ways of dealing with that don't require you to lose yourself in grief, right? Or if you do lose yourself in grief, to be able to bring yourself back from the brink of it. And so he says, now you know that about yourself. How do you apply that to another person who is another human being like you? Notice what Epictetus doesn't say. He doesn't say, go and teach that person Stoic philosophy. Straighten them out about what is in their control or what's not in their control. Instead, he says, do not, however, hesitate to sympathize with him as far as words go. And the term here in the Greek is actually sympathize. The pherein means to carry or to bear, and sympathy means, think about wrapping your arms, as we say, wrapping your arms around a problem or wrapping your head around a problem. You can embrace the other person. You can embrace their difficulties as far as he says, as far as words go, or if you want to think about it, as far as reason goes. Mechri logu, as far as reason goes. And he says, if occasion offers, you can even groan with that person. Again, there's a sun construction, with, right? You sympathize with them by being there, by listening with them, by saying, yes, it is unfair. Yes, it's a terrible thing. But what Epictetus then says afterwards that is the most important counsel is this. Be careful not to groan also in the center of your being. Don't allow that to get to you. It's quite possible to be sympathetic, or if you like, empathetic or compassionate. Sometimes people get hung up on these words. They all basically amount to the same thing. It's possible to have this comportment towards other people in their difficulties, in their failures, in the things that are happening to them that they cannot help but see as calamities. They cannot help but see as disasters that are befalling them, even though they're mistaken about it. It's possible to be sympathetic in words, in action, but without committing oneself to agreeing with them. A lot of times people think that it's fundamentally important that we agree in an emotional way with each other. And that's true when we're agreeing about what's actually correct. It's not important to agree with people when they're wrong. As a matter of fact, you're doing yourself harm by agreeing with somebody who has a mistaken perspective. And if they were in their right mind, they wouldn't want you to do that. If they were being rational, they would see that that's a bad thing, not only for themselves, but for you, that it's dragging you down along with them. So this is something that's quite useful. It shows us that Stoics are not uncompassionate, cold people, but that they have a sort of measured approach to a world in which we're all vulnerable to disasters and calamities and disappointments.
Remember that you are an actor in a play, the character of which is determined by the playwright. If he wishes the play to be short, it is short. If long, it is long. If he wishes you to play the part of a beggar, remember to act even this role adroitly. And so if your role be that of a cripple, an official, or a layman. For this is your business, to play admirably the role assigned you. But the selection of that role is another's.
I don't doubt that everybody who is watching this has heard at one time or another, whether from Shakespeare or whether from a Rush song, that the whole world is a stage and we are merely players. This is one of the origin points of that idea, Epictetus' Enchiridion. He says, remember that you are an actor, a hypokrites, the word that we get hypocrite from the New Testament, right? In a play, in a dramatos. And he says the character of which is, or what kind of play it is determined by the playwright, by the didaskalos, by the person who is teaching through the play. It's his choice, or her choice, or whatever his choice, right? So we've got this idea that the whole cosmos is really one vast play, and we all have our parts in it. Now, he says, if the playwright wishes the play to be short, it's short. If he wishes for it to be long, it's long. Now here's where it gets really important, because it has to do with us. If he wishes you to play the part of a beggar, remember to act even this role adroitly, right? If you're being assigned the role of a beggar, you can play it and be, ticked off about it and think that the whole world is unfair and against you, or you can play it well. What would that mean, playing it well? So that your moral faculty is in accordance with nature, so that you fulfill the roles that you have towards other people, so that you act with integrity. And you might say, well, how can you possibly act with integrity as a beggar? Well, maybe don't tell people that you're blind when you're not blind, right? It's not that difficult. And we can say this about so many other things, and Epictetus gives us a few examples. He says, if your role is that of a cripple or an official, or, as he's got translated here, a layperson, a non-philosopher, an idiotos, a person, or idiotes, a person who is not getting the opportunity to study or just hasn't studied, right? And we could say this in our own culture about so many other things. You're a man, you're a woman. You're going to be rich, you're going to be poor, you're going to be somewhere in between. At one point in your life, quite likely you're a student, and then at other points in your life you're something else. And we go through a lot of career shifts. Epictetus is not saying that you can't move from career to career with this, right? But those are different roles, and perhaps your role is a composite role that you're going to play different aspects of over time. What he's saying is that we should play the role well. We should do so without complaining about it. And he says, this is your business. He says, sugar tu testi. This is yours. This is something within your power. If we're going to talk about the dichotomy between what is not in our power and what is in our power. It's not in your power to choose what role you're actually given. Although that doesn't mean that you wouldn't, say, experiment around to see what your role might turn out to be, what you're well suited for, what the universe or the fate is telling you is your actual function. But once you've got it, whether you play it well or whether you do it poorly, that is up to you. That is something in your power. That means that playing your role well is something good. Playing your role poorly is something bad, because it is in your power. So he says, the selection of the role is another's. If you get upset about the role that you've been assigned, you're probably not going to play it particularly well. If you think that you ought to have been given the starring role, and you're constantly complaining about that, whatever supporting role you have is not going to be particularly good. If we want to use music as an example, think about a band, a rock band, where you have, say, two guitarists. One is a rhythm guitarist, one is a lead guitarist. You also have a bass player. You also have a drummer. You also have a singer, right? Let's say it's a 5-piece, right? And if the rhythm guitarist says, how come I never get to play any solos? I should get to solo just as much as the lead guitarist. I'm not going to play these riffs anymore. How does it sound? Does it work? Well, maybe the bassist, takes up the slack or something like that. Or the lead guitarist has to, drop down into a rhythm position, and now the solos aren't very good. What happens if the bass guitarist says, I want to play just the guitar line and I don't actually want to play the bass line, or I don't want to cooperate with the drummer? The whole thing falls apart. And we can say this about so many other things as well. So many activities which end up being dependent on more than one person doing their part. If we do our roles correctly, if we do what's in our power, then things work out better all around, and we feel better about what we're doing.
When a raven croaks inauspiciously, let not the external impression carry you away, but straightway draw a distinction in your own mind and say, none of these portents are for me, but either for my paltry body, or my paltry estate, or my paltry opinion, or my children, or my wife. But for me every portent is favorable, if I so wish. For whatever be the outcome, it is within my power to derive benefit from it.
It was quite common in ancient times for people to place some sort of trust or even a sort of superstitious faith in what Epictetus is talking about here in this chapter as portents. Another word that we use for that is omens. And there was a wide range of different practices, some of which were connected with particular places like oracles, some of which might be conducted by wandering practitioners, some of which were just widespread, some of which were culturally based, and I'll give you some examples of those in a moment. And all of these were relied upon by people who believed in them or weren't quite sure whether they believed in them or not, but kind of felt like these things were meaningful as signs about what the divine, what the God happened to think or gods happened to think, and about what the future held for them. So Epictetus is talking here about how we should approach those sorts of matters. Notice that he's not actually saying there's nothing to it, just ignore it altogether. Perhaps if he was in our own culture, that might be his response, although there's a lot of people who are very superstitious about all sorts of things along these sorts of lines in our own culture today. And there's many people who do it in a kind of hazy, more modern way, which doesn't necessarily talk in terms of the gods, but might talk in terms of the cosmos or karma or, the grand historical process or all sorts of these sorts of things. The main point is that people thought that there were signs available to them, which then they had to take into account. And one can have that sort of orientation about the economy, about the stock market, about one's job prospects. One can associate things that aren't necessarily accurate predictors, but are very striking with the things that we are concerned about. Now, the ancient Romans had all sorts of things. They'd cut animals open and take a look at their liver and see what was going on with that. There was the flights of birds and which way the birds were circling or who they landed on and whether birds attacked each other. There were all sorts of things. And if you look at any given culture, you can usually find some things along those lines. We have lots of expressions as well that are now, sort of worn out metaphors, but which originally conveyed some message about that. So what is Epictetus telling us about these sorts of matters? He says, when a raven croaks inauspiciously. Okay, so a raven, a korax, is a kind of blackbird, and it was felt like, maybe this is conveying some sort of message. Let not the external impression, the fantasia, carry you away, literally grab onto you and drag you along. But straightway, now notice what he says, draw a distinction in your mind. Make a distinction for yourself and say, none of these portents are for me. They're not for what truly is myself, my faculty of choice, my ruling faculty, my rational faculty, the things that are the higher part of ourselves that really are who we are, our character. None of these portents apply to that, but instead they apply to, and he uses this term here, which is translated as paltry, And that's sort of a rendering of what's in the Greek, to somatio, in the dative, somation would be like a little body, my own little body, or my own little possessions, ktese dion, or my own little opinion, or a better way of translating it here would be my own little reputation, what it is that people think about me. And now why is he talking in the diminutive? Well, in part to show the distance between the self, what is truly oneself, and these external things that we are all too often tempted to identify with the self and to place our good or evil in, as opposed to realizing that it lies within us. So he says, those sorts of things, external things, my body, my estate, my opinion. And notice what he also says after that. Or my children, or my wife. We might extend this to, or my friends, or my social media presence, or my parents, all of those things, we feel like we can get damaged. We feel like we're vulnerable in those matters, but they're really outside of ourselves. And so if the raven is crowing inauspiciously, it might be crowing inauspiciously for those things. Maybe the gods actually do send signs that say, you're going to get boils on your body, or your marriage is going to break down, or your child is going to die or run away, or tell you what a terrible parent you are and that they hate your guts, or any one of these sorts of things. You're going to lose your job. That's not something that the raven is saying about you. That's something the raven is saying about those external things. And so if we make this distinction, then we won't be so upset by the ambiguous signs that we're getting, these signs that seem to threaten us. He says, for me, every portent is favorable if I so wish. For whatever be the outcome, it is within my power to derive benefit from it. What he's saying here is very important. Notice there's two parts there. For me, every portent not only is something I could ignore, but it's actually favorable. Even if it's something about how my body is going to have something bad happen to it. I mean, you might think, for example, about the role that WebMD plays in our internet age in examining the things that are happening to our body. Oh my God, I've got this blemish here. I hope it's not cancer. I'll go and look it up. That's acting in a very superstitious way. And maybe it is. Maybe, you don't misinterpret the WebMD thing, and you really do find out that you're likely going to have cancer. And so now you go to the doctor, and you're sitting there in your hospital gown, doctor comes in and gives you the bad news. Well, I'm very sorry to say, but you have cancer. A Stoic would say, my body has cancer. I have the choice about how I'm going to deal with the cancer. I have the capacity to decide whether this is going to be indifferent and whether I'm going to face up to it with integrity, or whether I'm going to view this as a total calamity or something in between. That's up to me. And so what he's saying here goes beyond just merely withdrawing and saying, that's nothing to me. Epictetus is saying everything can be turned to good use. And remember that use, chresis in the Greek, use of external things is in fact something that lies within our power, is in fact something that is either good or bad, depending on how we use it. It is something that falls within the scope of our faculty of choice. So this is a very important affirmation that he's giving us here at the end. We don't have to be afraid of the threatening signs that we see on the horizon if we can learn to dissociate the things that are vulnerable to the processes that those signs might be signifying from what really does lie within our own control, what really is us.